Um, this is a fantastic panel of experts where some of them I discuss energy policy um, in my day-to-day job as a journalist, and I know that their insight is extremely good in energy and also natural gas, oil, the different policy options for countries in the region. I'm not going to go through the biography of every one of them. You know most of them already, and in any case, you have the full biographies on the booklet. Only to say that I'm privileged to have all of them here for the discussion. And what the model that we're going to follow in this panel is I'm going to ask each of them for some introductory remarks on the topic that we are discussing in this panel and through the conference, that is the energy challenge in the Middle East and North Africa region. And if I could start from my right, geographical right, not that anything else, Dick, could you say a few words on how you see, from the perspective of Shell, how do you see those challenges in the region?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to make 4 observations, perhaps 2 on the global context, one on MENA in general, and one more specific on the role of natural gas. Globally, you mentioned the word revolution already, Javier, the shale gas revolution that is taking place. So there will be much more gas available across the world, also in countries who did not produce that much gas before, because it's quite widespread. It will take time outside North America to develop that, but the long-term perspective is clearly of much more gas available. Some of that will be turned into LNG, or quite a bit of that could be turned into LNG, and you see LNG developed in other regions quite strongly as well, in Australia and new provinces like East Africa emerging. So if you think about what is my position in the global gas market, the potential of imports, there will be a large availability of a diverse supply of natural gas available. Second observation on the global level, MENA is not unique in terms of thinking through its energy strategy and its economic strategy. You see it happening everywhere. In the US, one of the tantalizing things happening is that on the basis of so much more gas available there, you see new monetization routes for gas developing. It's not just the LNG export, which is a classical one, but a turnaround for the US, as Ali indicated, but also LNG into transportation, for example, and a clear push for that type of downstream gas development as well. So you see a much bigger penetration of gas. In Europe, it's finding a way to combine economics and politics as well, which is in Europe not easy either. On the European roadmap, you could say that the vision there is about the combination of gas and renewables and how they complement each other going forward. In China, the debate is probably about so how fast can we develop how much more gas, either domestically or through imports, to replace a little bit of the coal growth. The demand there is almost infinite, you can say, against the existing coal growth. And the whole climate change issue boils down to coal in China, and that's where gas can play an enormous role. In Japan, as we just seen, you refer to that, it's stepping out of nuclear. I would be very interested to see if Japan could find a way forward based on efficiency, based on gas, and based on renewables, and have not that much coal in the mix going forward. Because then I think Japan could be an example, but we have to see how exactly that is going to develop. For the Middle East, same debate about economic strategy and the role energy plays in that, I believe. There's so many jobs that have to be created across the region. And we used to think of the Middle East and North Africa as the supply region. It still is. It has enormous reserves and supply potential. But we probably should look much more at this region as a market, as a consuming region, not just as a supply region, because the amount of energy being consumed is enormous. And you see the stresses out of that appearing in the power sector. Outages are an issue. The whole balance of domestic consumption versus export and now imports as well is clearly moving. And therefore, I think the MENA region will see some of the same issues and stresses we see on a global level about demand increasing. So what are the supply options to keep up with that increasing demand, and how about all the externalities like the environmental impact of the way we produce and consume energy. And that's where, from my perspective and from our perspective, we have such a firm belief in the role natural gas can play going forward in this context, together with more efficiency, together with more solar energy, but natural gas as well. It's economic. It's environmentally, it has huge environmental benefits, for example, compared to oil and coal in the power sector. And it's very flexible. Those are, I think, the three key words. Flexible in power generation, the way you can operate at low cost and be very flexible, but I think also flexible in terms of the LNG imports. It's a new dimension to the Middle East, but one that should not be underestimated, because it can be ramped up pretty quickly, and there's so much more gas potentially available to come where it's necessary. Also as a bridge, because that would be my final point about the Middle East, that there will be those new sources of gas, more difficult, will be available geologically in the Middle East as well. You know, it's sour gas, it's deep water gas, it's tight gas, it's shale gas. Ali talked about Algeria. There are other examples of countries in the region. So there's new domestic resource opportunities as well to develop, which I think underline the long-term case for gas, but more difficult, yes, at higher cost, but still very economic. And how to accommodate that, I think that's a key question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dargin of the University of Oxford. Please try to answer the challenge.
Yes, thank you very much. Great to be here. Basically, the way that I see the challenge is just in one more sustainability. What does sustainability mean? It means intergenerational equity. So basically, it means transferring the type of lifestyle that you have currently to the next generation and being able to keep that moving. So if we look at how that articulates into, let's say, the MENA energy sector, we see, at least from my view, I see three main issues. One issue I see is rising energy intensity. Now, of course, rising energy intensity, that's relative, because if you say that energy intensity is high, that means that it's relatively high to other regions that have been able to, let's say, produce or manufacture or what have you at, let's say, a lower energy level. So it's a relative concept. So if you look at the MENA region, and of course, not all countries in the MENA region have experienced increasing energy intensity, but if we look mostly at the energy-rich MENA countries, it has been increasing exponentially, in particular in the GCC. Now, if we move on to the next issue, which I see as rising natural gas consumption. Now, I don't consider that to be a problem in general, because actually I think that's a healthy sign. Because when you have rising energy consumption, well, of course, a vibrant economic industrial base, as it's modernizing, will consume more energy. So that's a fact of life. So I don't think that we should necessarily look at lowering energy consumption as a whole. I think rather we should just look at making it much more competitive. So I think that's one of the major issues. And then we need to, let's say, create a much more nuanced view in terms of, let's say, rising energy consumption cross-sectorally. So if we look at the relatively non-productive economic sectors, such as, let's say, the residential sector, which may not necessarily contribute that much to economic growth, then I think perhaps there should be a concerted effort to attempt to use various fuel sources in order to supply this growth as opposed to natural gas. Because natural gas within the region is very important for horizontal diversification. If we look at the petrochemical industry, if we look at also the industrial sector and what have you. So I think that there should be a focus on supplying these sectors with natural gas, and then perhaps having a very concerted, focused effort to bring down consumption within the residential sector, and also supplying it with other energy sources where possible and also where it's economic. And then the third challenge that I see is that of unlocking natural gas supply. Now, of course, there are certain challenges with unlocking natural gas supply in the region, because if you look at the incremental supply going forward across the region, we have some refer to it as unconventional gas, some refer to it as complex gas, what have you. But across the region, you have shale gas, Of course, you have tight gas, and then also you have sour gas typically, and of course this implies a much higher production cost. So I typically don't call this issue subsidy when you look at, let's say, the price of natural gas in the MENA region. And the reason why I don't call it a subsidy per se is because there's a certain logic to it. So when, let's say, oil production started apace and what have you, and let's say there was not much of an industrial base within the MENA region, then it made a certain amount of sense to supply associated natural gas to the industrial sector at a certain price, which I would not say is below the cost of production. But the issue is when you move on to, let's say, attempting to increase incremental supply from sources of natural gas which are a bit more complex, then the cost of production increases. So when you keep the same pricing framework as you translate to production from these new sources, then that causes various issues, and then you would actually start to have a subsidy. So I think that this is very important to understand. So two main issues are related to that, is attempting to encourage, to attract international oil companies to supply their technology, to supply their expertise, their managerial competence to basically producing from these very complex fields, and also joint training programs and so on and so forth, the list goes on. And then on the other hand, attempting to, as a soft policy option, to take another look or reassess what the domestic prices are in terms of internal provision, because I think that's important in the sense to encourage and to attract, let's say, investment in some of these fields. So for me, these are the three main issues going forward the way that I see it, and I think that the MENA region actually is not in that much. I'm quite optimistic, actually. I don't think that it's a very pessimistic situation. I think that I'm actually quite optimistic because now there's the realization across the region that change has to come, and I think that can help propel the region even forward.
From the Arab Petroleum Investment Corporation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's good to be here, share and learn. Because I come from an investment bank whose business focus is petroleum investment and whose footprint is the Middle East, North Africa, I come with another view about the challenges facing the region. And to understand better these challenges, we have really to put them into the global context of key trends and policies, but also into the regional context of lingering turmoil in parts of the region. As long as the global context is concerned, we all know through the studies, current studies by the major policy-oriented institutions, that energy on a global scale will continue to grow steadily, thanks to population growth and economic expansion. The IEA, OPEC, and the international, the United States Energy Information Administration all forecast 40% increase for the next 25 years. But also the three institutions and other institutions, particularly the International Oil Company, agree on two major shifts in terms of demand: geographical shift towards Asia, with India and China accounting for half the increment of energy, but also in terms of shift of supply. Oil is expected to be the slowest growing energy, but still dominant within the next 25 years. And it's natural gas really, which is coming stronger, probably growing 3 times higher than oil, as it's expected that natural gas will win the competition for power generation. What is the role of the Middle East and North Africa in this? Arguably, the Middle East and North Africa will supply the bulk of oil and a great share of natural gas. This can be argued, we can discuss it later, because there's a lot of uncertainty on the demand side, particularly if you move to China and India, and also the supply side, as MENA is burning more oil because of the because of the shortfall in natural gas. So what is the outlook for oil and natural gas? But even if we accept the assumption that 90% of the increment of oil will be supplied by MENA, and nearly 40% of the increment of natural gas will be supplied by MENA, this would need above or nearly $4 trillion of investment for the next 25 years. This is a little more than $150 billion per year. And this represents 10% of the total investment required worldwide, including power generation. $4 trillion of investment for the next 25 years is huge. And this investment definitely is not coming in the medium term for three reasons. The first one is the deterioration of the investment, climate, and the business environment because of the turmoil, as I said, except for the core producers, which are the four GCC countries, plus to some extent Algeria. All other countries are in lingering turmoil. The second element is the cost inflation. Leila Ben Ali earlier said one important thing is that when you look at the trend of investment over the last decade, for example, we saw huge growth, but actually it's really correlated with the cost inflation. Costs have at least doubled during the last decade or so, and they have been dampened by the financial crisis. But once the crisis and the economic recovery once the crisis is over and the economic recovery starts, we should expect the cost going up again. And the third challenge is really the financing of this investment. Financing is at the core of strategic decision within the corporation in the field, and financing is determined by the structure of capital. We have, within APICORP, we have estimated that on aggregate basis, when including the power generation, the petrochemical sector, we need 43% debt and 57% equity for this $160 billion per year investment, potential investment. And this risk not be a major challenge. The upstream is dominated by internal financing, that is mainly budget allocation from the state. Some returned earnings, but the bulk will be from budget allocation. And budget allocation from the state depends ultimately on oil prices. And we have found that oil prices below $90 to $100 per barrel will pose a problem for this financing. The downstream is dominated by internal financing. And internal financing, when you look at the capital market, it's not developed enough. Really, it's contributed very, very little to the energy sector. So the bulk of the financing will be debt financing. And the debt financing has collapsed, particularly syndicated debt financing, because of the European crisis and because also the turmoil in the region, as most banks have pulled out or just decreased their country risk exposure. So to sum up, I see three major challenges. The first one is the investment climate, which has deteriorated in most part of the region. The second is the relenting rising of costs, which will continue, most likely. And the third is the concerns on financing, and particularly the debt financing for the downstream, but for the power generation, for the generation itself.
Thank you. And finally, Bassam Fatou from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Again, in your opinion, what are the main challenges for the MENA region?
Thank you, Javier, for inviting me. Actually, I'm geographically disadvantaged. There are no more challenges to mention. But in any case, I will try to some of the challenges. I totally agree with that it's really no longer constructive to look at the region only as a source of supply, as historically has been looked at, and the region has also now become an important center for energy consumption. We've also witnessed a very rapid increase in energy intensity in the region as well. But what I've not heard so far is why is this the case? And I think it's very, very important to put all of this in its political economic context, to look a little bit into the political economic context. And I think there are two dimensions to that. So the first challenge of government is how to distribute the rent to the population. All of the rent is being accumulated in the oil sector, in the gas sector, and it has to go to the government, and the government is challenged of how to distribute the rent to the rest of the population. The second important challenge is how to create jobs for its local population. And I think if we start looking at these two trends, we can really start understanding why the region is really witnessing what it's witnessing at the moment in terms of rising energy intensity. So let's look at the employment generation.
So the first phase what a lot of the governments did, especially in the Gulf countries, is try to provide jobs in the public sector. So what we've seen, a rapid expansion in the public sector, but this has really come to a limit. There have been a lot of nationalization policies. They have replaced a lot of foreign laborers in the public sector, but this really has reached its limit. Really, they cannot do that anymore. At the same time, the expansion of the public sector, there are also limits as well to how long they can do that. So they had to rely on the private sector. The problem is that the private sector itself is really not taking enough people from the local people, from the nationals. So that's why a lot of these governments are very much under pressure to try to push the private sector. And the way they have done that is to try to push energy-intensive industries. And that's why what we have seen recently is that most of the private sector activity is in very energy-intensive projects. This actually has contributed positively to the region. Now the region is a very important petrochemical player, thanks to the cheap gas and to also government policy. The region has also, if you look at the stock markets, for instance, in a country like Saudi Arabia, it's very much dominated by these national champions, which were created as a result of cheap energy sources. So this is very, very important element. The second important element as well, in addition to generation employment, it's related as well, is how to distribute the rent to the population. And of course, Gulf governments distribute rent in very different ways, but one of the ways is cheap energy. Cheap gasoline, cheap diesel, cheap gas prices. Now, I think the biggest challenge, and I think that's is to ask the following question: are there better ways to distribute the rents than what we are doing at the moment in the region? So I think if we put the question from that perspective, I think we could come up with some constructive comments. Because, as you know, at the moment, the way we are distributing the rent through cheap energy prices actually is not a very efficient way. It's creating a lot of distortions in the economy. It's bringing a lot of challenges for the national companies, integrated national companies. Imagine if you're in a national company and you have to deliver gas at a very cheap prices. Okay, at the moment you're making a lot of money in the upstream sectors. You can cross-subsidize your refining sector, your gas sector. But imagine the distortions which you're creating in the middle of these national companies. Actually, it's not the best way to distribute income in terms of income distribution. Because who tends to benefit the most from these cheap prices? And I'm not calling them subsidies because I don't want to go into this debate of what defines a subsidy. But it tends to be that it's the richest people that in this region which tend to benefit from the subsidies. They have the biggest cars, they have the biggest swimming pools, they have the biggest air conditioning, etc. So I think this is the challenge. Are there better ways to distribute the rent? And I think there are some examples from the region and outside the region that there are other ways that we can think of starting to distributing rent without creating all of these distortions and all of these inefficiencies into the economy. I don't want to go into the details, but for instance, if you look at some countries within the region, for instance, like the example of Jordan, but also much poorer countries in a much worse position than the Gulf countries, such countries like Ghana. But if you look also at our, just around the corner here on Iran, as well, we can learn some lessons as well of how better way to distribute this rent. So I think if we try to analyze why we are having this rise in energy intensity and try to find a way and start asking the question in a different way, perhaps we can come with some creative and constructive solutions. So I didn't create challenges.
You mentioned some of them.
But at least.
let's start the conversation or the debate. And one thing that I want to ask Dick, because he's very close to that one, is we are discussing the situation of MENA as a natural gas supplier. And when I look at MENA as an oil supplier, a lot of people from the outside the region are very concerned. Will Saudi Arabia increase production? Will Kuwait be able to fulfill his plans or dreams of doubling production? And I'm very close. As soon as I talk to officials in the region and tell them how people outside the region are concerned about supplies, one thing that they point to me is, well, look at the oil production that is going to be coming from Iraq in the next few years. That should reassure the market, and I think it does. Is that the same case on natural gas, that we are a bit concerned outside the region on natural gas supplies, but in a few years it's going to be the case that Iraq is going to be providing a lot of natural gas in part with the consortium that Shell is leading?
I think what happened to natural gas over the past 5 years or more in North America is one of the few revolutions you will ever see in energy. We are a very slow-moving industry, highly capital-intensive, enormous asset base, so things move very slowly. And this one moved very fast because of certain circumstances and because it was in North America, as explained, the unique circumstances there. Even the industry was caught by surprise, so to say. And so let alone, we always have to remember that being in the industry, that politicians, they deal with a lot of issues, and energy is 8% of their time and not more. So we are still, in terms of the political realization of what that revolution meant, not just in North America, but it's going to mean across the world, we're just at the early stages. It is probably the realization of what is happening in the energy sector is only percolating halfway through the political system, and in terms of realizing what kind of extra options this provides and how we are going to make best use of it. So I think the phase we are in now is the realization that there will be so much more gas available throughout the world from a number of regions and a number of sources of supply, including the Middle East, but not solely the Middle East. It's really across the patch, from China to Australia to South Africa to Argentina to North America to the Ukraine to North Africa to the Middle East to Russia. They have it all there, also this one. And that should make us comfortable about thinking, so how are we going to make use of that gas? On a global scale, I think the big issue is the coal growth versus gas. If you look back the last decade, and we always underestimate coal, except when you're in the coal business. And with the IEA, I was struck by it, and I thought I followed it. The first decade of this century, 2 bars of growth of energy use. 1 bar is renewables, nuclear, oil, gas, everything combined. And the other bar, same length, is coal. So 50% of the growth in energy consumption over the past 10 years has been coal. So that's the big issue the world has to deal with. And this now available, still technical challenges, sometimes economical challenges, how to get it organized. But these new reserves of gas provide an opportunity to really change that picture in terms of the growth going forward. MENA is a subset from that, especially around oil versus gas in the power sector. And again, same issues around technical and economically, how fast to develop it, but realizing there's much more supply and there's much more flexibility.
In the challenge in the MENA region of subsidies, let's call it subsidies for the time being, and linked to that intensity of demand, how the panel will propose to address that? Because in part, as Ali was also mentioning, is part of the countries are energy rich, and it's part of the equation, the social contract in the region, that you get cheap energy. How countries are going to be able to move to reduce that intensity of energy and address the subsidies, keep social stability, keep political stability, and also Bassam, you were mentioning that countries have been building an industry, a heavy, intensive industry around that social contract. You could start.
Shall I start? Okay. There is no doubt that if you increase the cost of petrol or cost of gas, this is going to have actually a big impact on the economies of the Gulf or Middle East economies. First of all, there's going to be an direct impact on households, because those are direct consumers of energy, but also indirect as well, because as you know, energy enters into the production of many other products. So if you take the direct and indirect impact, the cost can be quite high. We have done some studies in the past, and we've seen that the consumer welfare can reduce anywhere between 10 to 30%. which is a big hit on their income. Also, the industry would be very much affected as well because, if you look at the petrochemical industry, what is the biggest advantage? Are two. It's not only that it's low cost, but it's also stable cost. So they do not have to deal with a lot of volatility of the cost. Now, so you have to address the economic consequences and also the consequences on the welfare. Now, one way to do that is to try to remove the subsidies and whatever money you gather, the savings, try to distribute them in a different ways. And this actually has been implemented in a couple of ways. Either you start targeting people, at certain income households, the poor income household, in terms of cash transfers, or you can do it as the Iranian model is basically distributed to all of the people. Now, the nice thing about this is that if you adopt this type of model through cash transfer, is that you do not create the distortions in the economy that low pricing do. And then in this way as well, the money you distribute, especially if you target it quite well, it tends to benefit the poor household. Because what we're seeing at the moment, and I'm not going to focus on the GCC, for instance, look at the example of Yemen, look at the example of Egypt. The expenditure on subsidies is something like multiple, 5 or 6 times the expenditure in education, 6 times the expenditure on health. If you save this money and start directing, your projects, and I strongly believe that the Gulf countries are in better position than a lot of other countries, like let's say in Africa or in Asia, and they have the administrative capability to do so. So that's what and this is actually one of the methods. The most important thing is to change the mindset, is that, let's find better ways to distribute the rent. I think once we start changing the mindset, I think we can start, thinking of potential solutions, but the solutions are there. So that's why I tend to disagree with what I've heard before, that it's impossible, it's very politically sensitive. It is, and that's why an integral part is communication. Communication. You need to inform the people. They have to understand what is the cost of all of this. The problem that in a lot of these transfers or these subsidies, they do not appear on the budget at all. They're implicit transfers. They don't appear in the budget. So you have to educate the people. You have to convince them. You have to talk to them about, what are the benefits of doing so.
Leila, you have just concluded this study for Syria. You have been looking at subsidies. How difficult do you think that removing some of them is going to be?
Well, instead of talking about difficulties, may I turn to opportunities instead, okay? Because we've talked a lot about challenges and negative aspects.
What is exactly? That's a very good one. What is the opportunity?
Right, the opportunity. I mean, we are in the region where we have the possibility to rethink macroeconomic policies in an integrated way. I mean, Bassam was talking about the Iranian model. Right, they have changed the prices, reformed the prices, delivered some cash handout to some part of the population or to a major part of the population, but has also created distortions on the other side of other parts of the energy value chain because it was not done in an integrated way, because it was done very quickly. They had their own challenges. So I think the first opportunity that we have here is this region has completely redesigned its macroeconomic policy, I would say, by the end of the 90s, the beginning of 2000. Now we are, I would say, at the beginning of a new cycle where there is an opportunity to rethink that macroeconomic policy and say, are we going to continue to support, I would say, gas-intensive industries, for example, at a certain level of a gas price, or should we look at I'm not thinking about changing overnight to a completely service-based economy like in Dubai, but trying to look at areas where, for example, if we want to tackle job creation, some sectors, selected sectors, which will need targeted support and reform the price for the others. That's one way to do it. So I think the opportunity is today. There's that window of opportunity today. Another opportunity, which is classically, especially viewed from European perspective, is viewed as a challenge, but it could be an opportunity, is the infrastructure challenge. I think Dick mentioned a little bit early on LNG being used in transport. I mean, we are in a region where several countries have moved very quickly on the infrastructure, and invested a lot on infrastructure side, but there are areas where where oil is still present because it can be transported easily. We can rethink the way we look at the energy value chain by completely viewing the transportation sector, or actually the infrastructure of the transportation, in a completely new way, regardless of what is happening in I would say, the traditional markets of Europe and the US. These are two challenges which I would think as opportunities.
I want just to move the debate with Justin and Ali is on something that some of you have mentioned, that is the energy mix going forward in the region. Until now, it's very reliant on crude oil and power. On natural gas for power generation, but there are some movements into just modifying that energy mix. Could you share your thoughts on that, and how do you see the energy mix in the region changing in the next few years?
Can I say a few words before on the question of subsidies?
Please.
Because really it's a huge debate, and I can see it like this. It's more important to address the subsidy to the industrial sector. It's really an urgent issue. If you look at the strategy within the region, the paramount objective is diversification. It's really to leverage oil resources, try to move beyond oil or beyond natural gas. And there are different strategies depending on the endowment in resources and how fast they are growing. But one of the strategies is vertical integration and going into the petrochemical sector. And the petrochemical sector has benefited from very low prices. But this now is working counter that paramount objective of diversification, because it encourages rent seeking. Let me explain this. Most of the private endeavors in the petrochemical sector are just preferred to be in the first and secondary processing, when they can benefit from huge rent. While if you try to push them further downstream, which is more job creating and so on, they said, no, there's no rent there. So there's a huge problem here. You have really, the governments in the region have to claw back that element of rent. And in this way, you create cross subsidies. So you can continue subsidizing for social reasons, for distribution of rent or whatever, prices to the domestic sector. Now looking at your question about other forms of energy, we've seen in recent years a determined move towards renewable and, for some country, nuclear. It's clear that there's huge potential for solar, but the nuclear issue is really you have to look at. It's different from in the GCC from North Africa. In the GCC, the first mover obviously was Iran. United Arab Emirates, more precisely Abu Dhabi, followed suit, but probably for other reasons. United Arab Emirates is probably a pure example of transparent civil program, and there's no doubt about that. You cannot really doubt about their objective. In Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit different, because they will look at United Arab Emirates within a framework of intra-GCC competition and say, well, we have to move also. And here we can deplore a lack of coordination within the GCC or a lack of common program. A common program on nuclear would have been fantastic things for the GCC economic integration. But anyway, the second motivation within Saudi Arabia, but this is a question, is it because is it countering Iran, which means are there any military thinking behind? Really, we don't know. And we don't even know what is the prime mover when it comes to nuclear. Is it politics, or is it just technocratic policy? My impression is that the politicians have probably other options than just developing nuclear in terms of strategic options. So I suspect that the policy technocrat have their say in this, or have been have waited in decision, like they waited into the gas development in Rab al Khali. Finally, it was the technocrat who really came up with this solution. And why the technocrats are pushing for nuclear? Because really they are seeing more oil burned to keep cool and to get water. And with this, we cannot ignore the huge opportunity cost, even in the case of Saudi Arabia, arguably. And they need more options than oil and natural gas. This is really my far-fetched explanation.
Justin.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, relating to your question, I think that actually we should take a nuanced view in terms of the energy mix. I think we should look at, for instance, as the energy mix for various sectors. So I would say that because natural gas is the backbone of industrialization in the MENA region, that really the industrial sector, the energy-intensive industries, manufacturing, so on and so forth, I think should actually have preference. They should be privileged in the sense of provision of natural gas, because these are the very sectors that add much more to economic growth, diversification, economic modernization, and so on. But I think that if we look at, for instance, the residential sector, then I think that there is clear scope for growth in utilization of, on one hand, let's say, certain alternative energy, but I think that we need to really be aware of what does this mean when we say alternative energy, because we just can't, as there's a colloquial saying, rob Peter to pay Paul. That means that we just can't switch around, let's say, an unsustainable energy pricing system or what have you, or energy support model. Basically, it's alternative energy whereby clear economies of scale have been shown to have a viable economic basis, and thereby you can supply it to whatever sector you want. And in my thinking, I think it should be the residential sector. So if we look at CSP, for instance, concentrated solar power, if we look at PV or what have you, I think in the MENA region, there is a significant scope for this, for deployability of this for the supply of the residential sector, residential needs, requirements, and so on. But I think that in terms of the industrial sector, I think that natural gas is clearly a winner going forward. And I think also, in terms of any supply shortfalls, I think that the MENA region should also look towards utilizing the very flexible and robust global LNG market. So I don't see why this may not necessarily be on the table for many countries. So I think that on one hand, there should be clear development of indigenous natural gas resources in order to supply the industrial sector. Then I think on the other hand, for the residential sector, for instance, alternative energy sources have been shown to be economically viable. And then on the other hand, for any natural gas supply shortfalls, I think that the global LNG market should be reached out to. And I think that right now is quite an auspicious time, seeing that there is so much natural gas supply that is coming online and forecast to be coming online within the next 5 to 10 years.
Leila.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the fuel mix, I think we can look at different scenarios. We can look at how things can evolve over time. When it comes to technologies which can generate electricity at less than $50 per megawatt hours, the choice is clear. We are talking about hydrocarbon-based or actually gas-based technologies, and for crude, there is that issue of opportunity cost that we can debate for years. But at the end of the day, we are talking about hydrocarbons. Now, when it comes to the other technologies, and I wanted to touch on nuclear more specifically, at the end of the day, we have to think about what is feasible and what is not feasible in the amount of time frame that we are looking at. If we're looking at 10 years, 20 years time, and if we take the example of nuclear, it still takes 8-10 years to develop a nuclear reactor, even in a nuclearized country. Now here, I think one of the key questions which is on everybody's mind is whether it's a binary decision, whether you give up enrichment, your right to enrichment or not. That's, I think, at the end of the day, is the question to solve. And even if you do that, which is the case of Abu Dhabi, what sort of pace you can develop those nuclear reactors. The first gigawatt, of course, the first reactor is always the most difficult to get. Once you have done that, you can develop that at a much larger scale. But here again, what sort of scale are we talking about? 1 gigawatt nuclear reactor would free up something like 50,000 barrels a day of oil. That's, for a country like Jordan, of course, it's hugely important. For a country like Saudi Arabia, scale is different. So at the end of the day, when we were developing those scenarios for 2030, we had to overlay those lead time constraints, scale constraints, of course, in addition to the political constraints, which are always in the shadow.
I'm going to start taking questions from the floor, and we are going to combine questions from me and the floor, but we are just getting a bit over time. So we have a first question here, and if you could just let us know who you are addressing the question or your comment, please.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. I think they are addressed to the majority of the panelists. The first one is, we all know that the region is witnessing, as well as other transformations in economic and energy, a major social political transformation. How does that, in the panels, affect the issues that are touched on, some of the issues? I'm thinking about the bank distribution issue, I'm thinking about the gas privatization issue, etc. The second question relates to the upstream. I mean, the region, as we all know, maybe is home to over 85 billion cubic meters of gas. So there's a lot of gas. We also often hear the issue of artificially low end user prices, gas prices, as being one of the major drivers of demand growth. Yes, but it's, as you also know, it also feeds into the economics of upstream projects. And upstream investment frameworks in the region in particular to be able to unlock that potential, issue of domestic prices is only one side of the coin. The other side is institutional capability, efficiency, etc. Those issues do affect and have affected the development of gas resources in a number of regions in the region. What does the panel think are the prospects for those other dimensions, in the absence perhaps of positive prospects for the issue of artificial low prices to be dealt with, for that other dimension to be dealt with, for efficiency to be introduced? And I'm thinking again, I go back to the issue of social political transformation. How does that affect those prospects? And since we're in the presence of Shell executives, what role can members play?
Thank you. Tig, why you don't take that question, starting from the second point?
Sorry, I'm still reflecting on the energy mix. I'll come to that. The one thing, because nuclear is really the binary one. It's in or out. And it's a very interesting one because it's not really economic anymore. So it's really a political or technocratic decision, and it's in the mix or it's not in the mix. It's one of the few resources who really have a negative learning curve. It's much more expensive now than it used to be in the United States in the 70s. So that's one really being politically motivated. I think there's a link between the discussion on prices and the upstream side as well. I think what's happening on the gas side is an interesting one if you look at it from a cost perspective, because there's a big gap in terms of cost between the associated gas we have. Laila showed the figures, extremely low cost / price. The conventional non-associated gas, relatively low cost and low price. And then at the other end, you have the oil price parity for gas. But I think the interesting thing to look at, and that was my question, and how are we going to accommodate that, is what is going to happen in the middle if you think about new resources that are being developed. All your deep water, your sour, your tight, your shale gas, your LNG imports, they all sit in between. So compared to oil used in power generation in whatever form or shape, it's extremely economic. That's why those deals take place as they take place. But still, it's a higher cost base. You can look into that as a problem, but at the same time, it gives you a different way of looking at what type of resources you can unlock and how to do it. From my perspective, from our perspective, we think IOCs can play a helpful role there as a partner. Ali talked about partnership. I would fully reflect that, which is about bringing in technologies which have been developed at a global scale, used elsewhere, bring them into the Middle East where necessary and applicable. It's also about integrating all the technology elements you need. It's about the scale. Sometimes it's about the financing ability. If you all of that bring together, I think you have a good value proposition. But it has to be done economically, and that of course is the issue to address. One thing about the pricing issues. I've been in politics as well in the past, and sometimes, things seem really impossible, but the other learning you have in politics is never underestimate the people. I think if you ask around throughout the region in terms of environmental awareness, it's growing. About waste, people are getting more aware of it. About who is benefiting from subsidies, the point being made, I think people are aware of it. So I think there's perspective or room for a dialogue there. It will take time, but don't underestimate the observations people make and what they are aware of, and how you can start the dialogue there.
Thank you, Bassam. Were you going to add a spokesperson for the group on the impact of the Arab Revolution in terms of the discussion on subsidies?
Well, it's very difficult to generalize, as you know, Hakim. Different countries have responded differently to the Arab Spring. For instance, if you take the example of Jordan, Jordan has done a lot in terms of reforming its energy prices. But what we have seen recently, as a result of the unsettlement in the Jordanian street, is that it hasn't increased electricity prices recently. It has gone back on increasing petrol prices, diesel prices. So in some countries, we have seen a retreat in the reform agenda. In the Gulf countries, I know that a lot of the countries here as well have very advanced plans in introducing pricing reform. But it seems now that they have gone back. And, one way that they can tackle the Arab Spring is perhaps by increasing the handouts, government spending, social spending, which is quite fine. Now, in terms of Egypt, for instance, you had a very strong petrochemical lobby. That petrochemical lobby is gone now. So perhaps, in terms of Egypt, for instance, reforming gas prices for the industry is likely to proceed smoother this time than before. So that's why what I'm saying is that you really cannot generalize all over the region when it comes to pricing reform. Now, I don't like to talk about gas crisis and try to make things very sensational. But we cannot have more gas demand. We cannot have more investment and cleaner environment and cheap gas and everything. We really have something has to give in. And I still think that if you really want a vibrant, dynamic industry, I think we really have to start talking seriously about the issue of pricing and what is best to rationalize that. Unfortunately, sometimes the debate takes the impression that someone is dictating from the outside, like the G20 agenda, sometimes of what the IEA. I don't think this is the right approach, and we should not only approach it from a climate change, because the issue of subsidies is very, very related to the social context in which it happens, and it's not only from a climate change agenda, like what we heard with the G20 agenda, that they're worried about subsidies because of climate change and because of rising energy and crisis and all of that. I think there are really serious issues. And if we develop our own approach within the region, I think that would be the best.
Do you have other questions on the floor? I have here a question and then the gentleman there.
Urgency of all the countries in the region, whether it's the ones which have challenges such as said that they managed to save price of year-on-year about 30-35% energy consumption. Probably some difficult number to achieve. Just saving 10% has a huge. That's my comment. And my question was maybe to Lena, more specifically, as the current and long-term price of gas in the US seems to hover around $2.8 do you think it has a big repercussion on industries in the region, industrial players in petrochemical in particular, who may want to use their business with the US, where we know that there's a lot of pressure to increase domestic investment, specifically in infrastructure and industries. The example that struck me, I just will cite one, is OCI, Orascom Construction Industries, announced 2 weeks ago that they are starting a multi-billion-dollar petrochemical complex, abandoning the future investment in Egypt and investing little benefit. He spoke later on with Nasser, the chairman of the company, and he told me, and he told me that as a matter of fact, he has locked the gas price for the next 8 years. It cost him but that's what he said he did. He said that at least I have less geopolitical risk from the US and I have better price. What should I spend in the region and what should I stay in the region?
Okay, I will tackle on the first point on efficiency very quickly. We've done some analysis and we've done very theoretical analysis, so the numbers I will throw away are a little bit wild, I would say. If you, in the power sector, if you switch overnight all OCGTs, or open cycle gas turbines in the region, to CCGTs, and if you switch overnight all subcritical boilers to supercritical boilers in the region, you can save the equivalent of 100 BCM of gas and 1 million barrels a day of oil. But that's very theoretical, of course. But you can probably assume that 10%, 20%, 30% of that amount could be achievable. That's just one brief point on efficiencies which could be done on the power sector. On your question about the industrial and whether they would displace production to other regions, including the US, I mean, that's something, that we've looked at. And it's true that if you look at the issue of pricing only, of energy pricing only, it's true that there's still room to increase prices in the region. I'm not taking the example of Egypt because that's really specific example, but there is room to increase prices to, let's say, $3-4 was the threshold that I mentioned in my presentation, and still be competitive, just from the fuel pricing point. Now, of course, you have other parts of it, especially like in the aluminum industry. Human resources are also a major part of the cost. The alumina and other parts of primary material are a major part of the cost as well. So these are also considerations to be taken into account. If we take most of the region, outside of Egypt, you saw my supply and demand balance in the case of Egypt, which is making things quite difficult in that country. And the fact that we are moving to shorter-term arrangements, flexible arrangements in pricing, and to get back to Bassam's point early on, heavy industrials prefer a long-term stable supply, even if it is a little bit more expensive, that's fine, but long-term stable supply. An aluminum factory would run billions of dollars of cost losses if they don't get their fuel supply for more than 4 hours or 6 hours, if there is a shortage there. So these are, I would say, aspects which go beyond the pure pricing question.
Bassam, you wanted to add
just a very quick point. I've heard a lot that in the US actually there's a petrochemical renaissance, but at the same time, we're hearing that there's a lot of demand for gas in the transport sector. There's a lot of demand for gas in the petrochemicals. there's a lot of demand in the power generation, and they're going to export. Now, do you think all of this will not affect the price? You know, something has to give in. You know, all of this demand is going to increase the price. And if you're thinking of a multi-billion investment for a very long period of time, you don't only worry about, you know, the price today. You have to worry about the stability of the price. And okay, you can hedge your price for 1, 2, 3 years, 4 years ahead, but then what after that? So I would be a little bit cautious. I'm not saying that it's not going to change the scene, but I would be a little bit cautious on news like this.
Only very briefly, please.
Yeah, I pass the question. You've got a very good answer from Bassam. I'd like just to make a comment on your comments. You're very right, because when you look, I referred earlier to the economic diversification within the region, and they are underpinned by long-term vision, which are shared by the elite in most part of the country. But this vision dates back to the end of the 90s, early 2000s, and they are really what they take in is competitiveness, embracing globalization, and promoting social progress. But now this elite is realizing that embracing globalization should include also taking account of global trends. And these global trends are energy efficiency and decarbonization. So the environment, and so really they have to revise this or to update their vision. And it will have implication, obviously, on the...
I'm going to have to close it here because we are massively over time, so I'm going to apologize to the panel and some of you that I know that you have questions. We have now, let's try to keep it to 15 minutes, so be back here at 5 o'clock. We have now a coffee break where you could continue having the conversation with my panel, but please join me in saying thank you to all of them for their expertise.